Dear colleagues, let me start. Welcome to this roundtable discussion on technologies in translation industry and fit for practice technological translators training. Let me introduce the panelists, which are sitting on my right is Mr. Milan Bischel from the Department of German Studies, Faculty of Arts at the University of Ostrava. Then there is Michal Kmeď, President of the Association of Translation Companies of Slovakia, Miloš Švantner, freelancer and member of the Slovak Literary Translators Society, Mr. Dragoš Čoban, Associate Professor in Translation Studies from the University of Leeds, and then Matúš Kamrat, translator from the department, from the Slovak department of DGT of the European Commission. As I noticed shortly, we have 4 men starting with M in my panel and just 1 with D, so we have decided to rename him, but let me start with the first question. We have recently heard in another presentation that there is a 38% probability of translation jobs being computerized, so do you think that translators will be replaced by machines in future? Anyone of you can start.
Well, if I may, I think definitely no, because cognitive functions are among the most difficult things to program actually. And I think that's the answer. No. Maybe you know, those who were translators until now might change their jobs, but they will be no more translators in the real sense of the word. You know, translators will stay translators. That's what I think.
May I add something to that? So first of all, I think although we have many hypotheses, I'm not sure that we have many actual explanations about what translating actually involves. So there have been developments in empirical research methods, so we have eye tracking studies, we have keylogging studies, we've had think aloud protocols for a long time trying to make sense of what goes on in the black box, but we still don't know what's happening. So from that point of view, if we don't know how something functions, we can easily replace it with something else. And also I think, as we've heard, and probably we will hear for the next 2 days, there are lots of assumptions in our industry, and one of them is that we understand what translating actually involves. And one is that artificial intelligence takes over and is very clever, but we've already heard that we are only at the stage of weak artificial intelligence, not strong one. So yes, your phone will tell you where you are, and based on the time of the day, will suggest some restaurants to go and have lunch if it's midday, but it's not going to tell you why you're hungry or why you want a particular type of food, or so the explanations are still down to the people. So that's one assumption that we should maybe not focus so much on at the moment. And the last one is that the training data for artificial intelligence and the content that we translate is perfect, and it's not ambiguous, and it doesn't have challenges, and therefore it can be treated automatically. And everyone in the room knows that, again, that assumption needs to be challenged, and it's easily challenging. Thank you.
Actually, I think the contrary. The question is not if the translators will be replaced in the future, the question is when. I mean, the technologies are advancing. Maybe we won't be replaced in 50 years, but maybe in 100. I mean, the Industrial Revolution started somewhere in the beginning of the 19th century, and by the end of the 19th century, when you compare it, for example, to shoemaking industry, the shoemakers were replaced by mass-produced footwear. So, yeah, I think that's the future for the translators as well.
I would sort of agree and disagree with the shoemaking example. I think that good translators who are specialized in a field that they translate will not be replaced by machines very soon. And as a comparison, I would draw a comparison with the shoemaking industry, that you can buy a shoe that's made by a machine in large quantities. On the other hand, you can still go to a shoemaker and have a tailor-made shoe made just right for your fit. So I think the translators are here to remain the good ones or the best ones, and then the not so good ones, that's the question. I think those can be easily complemented or replaced by machines.
Yeah, they are replacing in 100%. I don't know, I'm not sure about it. The main skill of human translator is still, and will be still, I hope, the critical thinking about translated text. And it's still domain of human translators, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I think we all agree that more or less in some time the computerization of our work will be there, and it will be more and more dominant. And as you said, the good ones will stay, not so good ones not. But then what do you deem separates the good ones from not so good ones, and what other soft skills translators need to acquire to really ensure the superiority of humans over machines?
Okay, I can start again. So. The question actually, it's like that, you know. An IT guy sees a string of characters, and the translator, human translator, sees the culture of that language, sees the history of that language, and not only of that language, but also the language which it translates from. So, you know, if you can program that, I would wonder, I mean, when can it become true? I cannot imagine that. You know? So these are the soft skills, on the soft skills, so to say.
So the culture
and
the
hard soft
but
skills.
at the same time we said that the IT savvy translators are in demand, so then we need to somehow make a balance between the two, of course. I would say, yeah, but we can take a question from the audience.
Thank you, but do we need these cultural things related to language when we are doing technical translation?
Yes, definitely, yes. Yes, because, you know, in science you have also history, and you have, in each nation you have a different history of science. So, for example, in Slovak science, we are influenced a lot by the German school. So a lot of things are, you know, named in analogy to German names of things, in technical things. So if someone tries to translate into Slovak and doesn't know this, I mean, an automated process can't do that, you know, it's not possible. So domain is really the thing, you know.
But when this system is similar with German, it means that we can translate from German without cultural background?
Sorry, I didn't understand this question, sorry.
You said that our language, like, it's based on German, that we are trying to...
Not language, I was talking about, language, but in the strict sense of technical language, you know, tradition, technical tradition.
Okay, so if our language is based on tradition of German technical text, it means that we can translate technical text from German without cultural background.
No, no.
Because you said it right now. Or not, maybe I misunderstand something.
No,
We can talk about it during coffee break.
yeah, maybe.
Mr. Kushel, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I want to say there are many possibilities and ways how to present technical, specific scientific informations during a translation process, of course, but the main position is if you translate, for example, a user's manual for a car. If you buy a car, I can, in the position of in the position of translator, expect that you are a professional for car industry and automotive. It's necessary to present technical or scientific information into non-scientific publicum or recipient. That's, I think, the point.
Yeah, when speaking of soft skills, I think the main, the future for the translators will be creativity. This is probably something the machines are not able to learn. And I mean, when we look at the history of thinking machines, there were approaches to learn machines playing chess, and then they competed against human chess masters, and the machines were finally winning. But actually, according to some new studies, the most powerful and most successful is a team of a human and machine. So that beats every other machine or a human. So that will be probably also the future for translators.
Another question, yeah, from the...
It was actually not a question but a comment. When you say that you can present the scientific information on a special way to a public, but the source text already do it, so you don't need to do it during the translation, I think, when we speak about this car instruction. So already now a lot of kinds of these texts are made by computer, or the translations are made by computer, and often better than by a human, I'm afraid.
On that point, perhaps we should also take into account a growing, already established field of the industry, which is the localization industry, where, as you said, the technical manual is helpful to the recipient in the source language, but there was a recent podcast on the Moravia Globally Speaking series comparing the Japanese market and the European market and even the States market on how the Japanese consumer expects to receive information and how the Japanese consumer appreciates technical information, whereas in the rest of the world it seems that the purchase is led by the perceived benefits for the buyer. So even though the machine translation might do an excellent job of technical documentation because of control language, because of large amounts of training data, if we are talking about the presentation of this information, about the purchasing process, about persuading customers, then the job of the localizer is still there, and linguists can still add a valuable service, it seems.
Okay, so my next question then for the panelists and also for the audience would be, which other technologies and skills, apart from the CAD tools, would you recommend to teach at universities? Are these subjects making translation students fit for their job? Yeah.
Apologies to my panelists and to everyone. Before that, I was wondering if we could also include in the list of soft skills adaptability and also skepticism, because we've been talking about technology, we will continue to talk about technology in follow-up sessions, but I think there is a danger there that at least I'm noticing with my students, that they do trust, because they grow up with the technology, they do trust everything that comes out. So we heard how little translation memories are actually questioned, although the process of building a translation memory is extremely easy with unvetted information. So training our students and expecting future linguists to be more skeptical, I think, is not going to go amiss. And also adaptability is important, because we heard how we are quite optimistic about the future of linguists versus machines. It's not really a us versus them debate, but anyway. But there are already quite a lot of people who know what they're talking about and who say that maybe the question should be posed as humans with computers will replace the humans that choose to ignore technology. And that's a bit of a more likely scenario. Thank you.
May I add to this something? Recently I bought a charger for the car battery for my car, and it had instructions for use, translated, I don't know what the original language was, but it was translated into 5 languages, and 4 of them said that it is okay to use this charger only outside, and the Slovak translation said it is okay to use this charger only inside in the building. So this is a question of accountability. Who is accountable for this? This was not checked by a human. You know, no human would do this. So there we go with machine translation, unchecked.
Or maybe it was revised by a second translator and he missed it as well. Yeah. But if I may add into the discussion about soft skills, I approached this from the business point of view, and what I see as important for future translators is a professional or decent level of interaction with humans, because this is something that I find that sometimes translators are missing when they are dealing with their customers or other colleagues, that they are not the people who are the best communicators. I mean, they are very good in writing and expressing themselves with written words, but this is sometimes missing, or accepting some not so positive feedback, etc. And I think this could be critical at the moment when you, as a client, are faced with a hard to talk human. And you are then thinking, okay, so maybe if I talk to a computer, or if I use a machine instead of this person, I mean, I'm without this problem of facing this rude or not very nice, unprofessional person to talk to.
Yeah, in the morning there was, or in the afternoon, I don't remember anymore, but there was talk about teaching also project management. And I think that should be also a very important part of translation studies. But I remember, Dragos, you wanted to say something about interpreting as well. That helps also for translators.
Yes, and again, I'm sorry to bring the discussion back to technology. There will be more technology after this. But the new technologies, especially, for instance, speech recognition, is applied extremely easily, without much of a learning curve, by interpreters who are used to their sound of their voice, first of all, and also who have the training in sight translation and are very competent and confident to produce text that way. So I think it's time that we embrace the technologies that actually work, but we also, as you said, in terms of project management, we start training our students to see the big picture, because at least, so I can only speak from my point of view, I won't generalize because I do not have enough information for that, and I think none of us does. But we see a lot of small tribes or even large tribes within the industry. We see translators, we see interpreters, we see the professionals versus the crowd, and there's a lot of tension. We see the project managers versus the linguists, and it's interesting in some research that we've done in Leeds how actually these myths, I think we were talking about in the morning, persist, and how a linguist will typically undervalue the project manager, while there is so much value that's added by the project manager. So I think we really must give the full picture to our students with evidence from all the people who contribute in the process.
For my part, I remember very well what I have missed after I finished translation studies and started freelancing. It was definitely sales and marketing skills, which are totally underestimated. But the question is, what should the translators and interpreters be taught to be fit for the future jobs? It's hard to predict how the market will be in 5 or even 10, 15 years. And the problem of making the education future-proof is not only limited to translators and interpreters. Also, other studies face the same problem. And I think the crucial points are not to focus solely on technologies, but rather on concepts, critical thinking, which has been already mentioned, active problem solving, but also self-development. So the students have to be prepared that they are not done when they are finished with the studies, that the situation may and will probably change, and they have to adapt and learn new skills, learn new technologies.
Lifelong learning, that's what we call it at the European Commission. Any other remarks, maybe from the audience? Yeah, Martin?
Thank you very much for the floor. I just keep wondering whether they had a similar discussion in Gutenberg's time, if machines are going to replace writers.
Definitely.
And then in the period of typewriters as well. I mean, we cannot ignore computers, that's obvious. And I think that it needs to be taught at the university level, definitely. But, for example, from a market point of view, if we talk about machine translation, and this is probably a question for Michal, how often do you get commissions to conduct post-editing machine translation? How often do you do it? And the rest of you, translators, how often, could you tell us probably approximate percentage of your work that is being conducted through post-editing machine translation? Because there's been a lot of talk about machine translation, but we haven't talked about market demand yet. Is there a demand for such translation? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think that the company which I represent is not the best example of a machine translation translation services provider. We actually had one bigger project when we persuaded a Slovak client to do a machine translation of large volume of tourist industry-related texts, and that was actually from Slovak into 2 foreign languages. But they were really willing to take it on because they had a fairly limited budget, and it works for them. But we do not do any post-editing on a daily basis. But I think there would be, I see maybe Rado, you would be a better example in your area, and maybe if there's Jakub in the room, maybe he will have more data, more relevant data from our perspective.
In the European Commission we use machine translation a lot, but we use it as a tool, actually. So, and differences, there are big differences between or among colleagues. Some don't want to use it at all, some use it a lot, and some are somewhere in between. So it's individual, actually. But as I said before, the accountability comes down to the person who signs that I have translated this text. You can use tools, but you are responsible for your output. So, and to this question, I cannot estimate the percentage of usage, how often this machine translation is used.
I think that, to answer this question, it's also going to be very useful to have a look at the ELIA, so European Language Industry Association, EU ATC, European Union Association of Translation Companies, GALA. All of them, they did a survey together. They did it in 2016, they repeated in 2017. And there you can see a very clear graph which maps the size of a company as opposed to the percentage of companies who use machine translation. And there you see without any shadow of a doubt that the bigger the company is, the more they deploy machine translation systems. We tend to speak about machine translation as if it's one thing, but then it so much depends on the language pair, the training data, the domain, that you actually need a proper team to conduct the deployment, the training, the checking, the validation. You also need to work with the freelancers. So not all the companies have these resources or this interest as well. So I don't think it's a question of it's a fad. For the big companies, it certainly is not. And as the big companies become even bigger and as the industry centralizes itself, it's a reality. It's just that, are we going to be prepared? And it's not taking us over, it's just asking us to slightly change the things we do. Are we still committed to fostering education across the globe, or are we so hung up on the specific job details that we grew up thinking that we're going to do that we can't let it go? I think it's more of a question of that.
I would maybe add to that from the perspective of a fairly small company, as I talk in our office or with some other companies of similar sizes, is that there's a growing number of freelance translators, even seasoned ones, who deploy the free or freemium machine translation models, contrary to their NDAs they have signed with their clients, or just for their own benefit. So, and if you prevent them using it in the kettle, then they complain that why did you turn off the Google plugin for me? It really helps me to translate. But if you ask them, could you please post edit this? No, I don't use this tool. So I think this is something that also can be addressed during the study, etc. But I don't want to go into this. This moment. But this is something that's happening. That it's not only top-down force that may be pushed, but we see that also is bottom-up tendencies of translators to be using it.
But that also brings up a very important point of ethical training that we can start in the universities, and then we can also keep talking about it, because you have very specific workflows and the clients expect something, and if that process is actually missold and new technologies are introduced instead of certain processes, then that's an ethical issue as well. So it seems that maybe historically the translator's invisibility was the biggest defining factor of this industry, but this has certainly changed, and it's a business, it has standards, it has business practices and well-established companies. Not everyone is out to scam the translator or scam the client, on the contrary actually. And there is a lot of content out there to be translated. So whether it is translated from scratch or with post-editing, that will be decided by the most appropriate process. It's not a question of throwing our arms up in the air. But we need to take this whole process seriously and respect everyone who is actually adding value into it.
Here maybe another point of view from the university in Central Europe. The translation studies in Czech Republic in the University of Ostrava are a part of Faculty of Arts. traditional faculty of arts, and there are many more subjects, lessons, soft skills, hard skills, and so on. And this technological part, CAD tools, is one of about 12 subjects these students have to pass. So if you don't study directly technology or CAD tools, it's really hard to educate all students in all skills being necessary.
And then there's my question, I mean, if they study the CAD tools, do they study what is available on the market? Do they study just one, like we heard here, MemSource? How well are they really prepared to work with these tools once they are employed? Because that's usually, I mean, then it's the translation agencies that have to educate the students that have finished their translation studies.
If I may start, I think they should get out of the university with the lifelong learning in front of them, that they will just have to keep on learning to be able to be on the front in the industry and to be able to serve the clients. And as far as I understand CAD tools, I think that the principle is fairly the same in most of them. So I think it really doesn't really matter if they are trained in MemSource, SDL Studio or MemoQ. It's important for them to have the skill, what it does, how they can use it to their benefit or to the benefit of the client and the text that they are translating, and try to install into them the view that there will be multiple CAD tools that they might use. Some of them might be so lucky that they would end up with one client or one employer who would be using one CAD tool. Somebody would be very happy to use a no-CAD tool, for example. But I think this is, with regards to CAD tool, I think it's fairly simple. Where I see a bigger room for improvement is to give them the basics, so that they are computer savvy, I would say, in general, so that they can update their computer, install an antivirus software, update of the CAD tool, etc. Because this is something that we see from the practical point of view, that many times our project managers connect remotely to our translators' computers to do that for them, because they are just not really that good. And the good news is that the younger generation is better equipped, but still there's a big difference even between the young ones, the fresh graduates, that they are not on the same level, all of them.
If I teach the CAD tools or the subject with this name, I explain the students the problems, we had introduction and so on, and if we try to do practice on computers and so on, the first reaction is shock. What's that? How can I manage it? It's too difficult for me. It's not something what I have been prepared for in the previous study, and they think it's hard to use it. And I have one semester long for motivate them that it's a really good thing, you can manage it, and if they in the second half of the semester, they are able to export the first translated text, they are happy about it. There is another shock. They need to protect and manage the quality of translated text. It's not so easy, but definitely at the end are they able to import, translate and export the text, five pages. In my case, we use one CAD tool, Transit, and I teach, or I try to do it on one topic text. It means car industry, because of German and Czech economics are very car industry oriented.
Slovak at the moment.
I want to go back with my experiences leading workshop for translation students. I had a similar experience as Michal has described, that the students weren't able to do basic operations on their computers, like creating a folder, copy files, etc. I wondered about it, but as it has been already said, that you are digital native doesn't mean that you are also literate. So it seems to me that all we have the feeling that now the young people, the young generation, they are so tech savvy, but actually it's not true. They have to learn these skills as well. And I mean, we can't get around about it. The computer is, or tool, not the CAD tool, the software we run, but the computer as such. And if you want to work with the computer, we have to understand it. So that's also something what is important for translators.
I guess we also, well, the answer will depend on the various countries and courses that we're talking about, and the industry in that particular country, of course. But I guess all of us are, at the back of our minds, are thinking, okay, who am I training these students for? Is the goal that they become, and excuse me for the crude image, but just faster hamsters on wheels? Or are we training them for a future where they can actually make a productive contribution? So to become faster hamsters on wheels, they can learn the CAD tool. They will be more productive, they will be valuable to the industry in the short term, but there's no point in competing with artificial intelligence, weak or strong, on something that can be automated. The actual future, and again, looking at the industry predictions, TAUS is a very useful organization to keep an eye on, Translation Automation User Society. They release updated reports. They're talking about the future of AI, where if you want to actually make a useful contribution, then you have to understand how the CAD tools, how the technologies work together, and how you can optimize the whole process. So I think it's a very good start, and it's a big challenge to train so much technology in parallel with translation skills and all the soft skills that we have mentioned. But I think our students should have a look at the current stable points that we have. So for instance, in the European Masters in Translation Network, we tried and we came up with, and then we revised it even, and so it's more accurate, a list of competencies. So look at those before you come on a translation course, so that you don't get the shock of, I have to use a piece of technology, but I want it to be on a lonely island with my dictionary. Because unfortunately that scenario is romantic and you might be able to do it, but you're not going to be able to live from it. So I think, yes, we think ahead and then we decide several, project management, other things as well.
I was just going to briefly add that then we may face the reality of the quality of the students and their motivation to be actually studying and graduating, and what percentage of the translator graduates are actually interested in translating or working in the industry, because that means I can understand that if there's a small fraction of students within a class of then it's really difficult for the faculty members to persuade them to study the CAD tools, etc. Because from my perspective, I was going to say, why do you teach somebody a CAD tool for half a semester? I think it can be something to get the basics. I mean, it's a 2 or 3 hour activity for somebody who's really motivated and eager to use it. And if you have to motivate the people to actually to learn it as part of their study, that's sad. But I think that's what I hear, that this reality at the moment, that very few students are motivated and actually they would be self-propelled and to advance through the study.
Yeah, maybe it's a question of time. The demotivation is present by students. They are studying now, they have to pass an exam and so on. But the reflection or reaction by our absolvents, of our graduates, after 1, 2, 3 years, they come back and say, yeah, it was a good thing, and I was stupid that I learned not so much as I can't.
Please, I would need more information about hands-on traineeships, basically in translation agencies during the studies. Is this going on, in what scale, or how does it work in different countries? We have here University of Leeds, etc. So, because this might solve the problem, basically, as Mr. Kmet said, why teach someone the whole semester if it takes 3 hours and then maybe 1 week in an agency where they can try it on real projects, etc.
On the subject of internship, I'm the least qualified person to talk about, because in Leeds we have, so in the UK generally, the MA programs only last for 1 year. Our students, if they want to do internships, they do them on their own during the breaks. But as I have in my follow-up presentation, there's actually research into what the students actually do during the internships. So I think maybe us in the academic community, we've been guilty of just passing off to the companies all the things that we thought were beneath us or too complicated to train. And the companies have to run a business, and having an intern is actually demanding on their resources and mentoring and checking all the time. So I think we underestimate vastly the amount of work that the companies are putting in, and the fact that they are willing to take on our students is a very big thing in itself. So I think there is quite a lot more that we can do on our side in the training departments to give the big picture, to show the variety of technologies, to again build this appreciation of the whole process. But we are in a very good position because we have these companies. But what I wanted to say was, there was a time when if you did languages, you thought, I'm going to be a translator. If I'm lucky and very good, I'll be an interpreter. Otherwise, I'll be a language teacher. But that is just another myth or something that happened a very long time ago. If you go to any student, can blag their way, I guarantee it, into an industry conference without any issues, and there are many such conferences around. MemocFest, LocWorld, Ilia, just try it. You will see on every single conference program that there is at least one panel on attracting and developing talent. The companies are crying out because they cannot find people who are qualified enough to take on the jobs that they need. And it's not just translation, it's about this big whole process that is involved. So the students should talk about motivation. If we present the course as in you come, you learn a bit of a translation skill with us, and then you're on your own, it doesn't sound the most exciting thing in the world. But if you say, okay, well, this is the world of the translation industry, you have so many open gates, but you have to put in the work to find these many things. I think that starts to become a bit more of a viable proposition.
If I may say, I think I should say something on behalf of the companies and the internships. I would start at saying that it's very fragmented because there's a very large number of language service providers, not only in Slovakia but in general in Europe and in the world, and many companies have many different needs. I can imagine that a very small company would not have any possibility or means to actually have an intern or spend time with a fresh graduate or somebody finishing the university. I know that here in Slovakia, different companies apply different means of how to get fresh graduates work for them in a way that is suitable. I know that many times it involves quite a lot of additional training for some of the companies, and then there are companies that just reap the benefits and try to get somebody who's already trained by somebody else. But I don't want to be only blaming the universities for not preparing the students very well. We've had I believe a very productive meeting, some of the Slovak translation companies with universities. earlier this year where we identified some topics that we should mutually work on, the university's part and the OSP's part, and I think that there's a lot of opportunities for students to practice their translation skills, and it's not just the translation companies. I know that, for example, the University of Maciej in Banská Bystrica, I'm looking at you, and also here the University in Nitre, they are fairly, from my perspective, very active in terms of how and what to offer to students to get some practice, even though it's not only translation companies, but then it falls also on the motivation of the student. Somebody who just walk up to our door and ask for a proof that they translated something because he or she wants to give it back to the professor and not to translate anything. And then there are others who are maybe not so skilled, but they really want to try hard and translate. So.
Any comments from the audience? No. We still have about 10 minutes, and I wanted to add another topic which I mentioned during my opening speech, and that is that the forum this year will be focused on translation in the age of data, and translators working with data and data working for translators. So as you mentioned, there is a lot of content, there is a lot of data. How can translators basically use this data for their benefit? What do you think?
Winning gambit. Again, TAOs, their livelihood is looking into trends and researching the market. They had a very interesting webinar last week on the 20th about blockchain and this new technology underlying framework, actually, which not many of us know a lot about. But what they were talking about was how the industry will change and there will be new roles. So we talk about translators here, revisers, perhaps terminologists. Some of the new blockchain companies are talking about miners who are gathering this data, polishers who will make sure that the data is correct, because at the moment the resources, not even with the big companies, are good enough. And then the people who will actually add the value, and they will create new content, they will post-edit. So at the moment, we've heard that some of the freelancers are already using the free MT tools, but they also can use current, like Tilde, like the Microsoft systems that they can personalize with their own data. The DGT has released millions of segments that everyone has, who's serious about translation, has been using to train their MT engines. Yate is under the European Commission, has a wonderful resource on terminology. There is a lot of data and there are lots of resources, so I think we need to train our students to evaluate and then apply whatever is suitable for the domain. But don't just trust the label, essentially.
That's the skepticism part, that you have to be skeptic and not trust everything anyone else.
Yes, I think that working with data is really important for students, and it could be actually achieved very easily. Every teacher should strive to teach students how to spend their time on the internet, actually, because that's the most important source of information. If you spend your time on internet browsing, for your free time activities, that's the one part. And to be able to use internet for gaining knowledge, that is, for me personally, I think that's the main principle behind this. So that we could have translators leaving universities and being able to understand what irony is, and what is the irony behind, for example, phrases like smartphone, so that they know how the technological things work, but also understand what irony is. The list goes on, like social networks and so on. You have a really long list of ironic terms. So for me, better managing the time spent on the internet is crucial for this in teaching.
The question is also, when we speak of data, what kind of data? I mean, and what we plan to do with it. When we think of different kinds of bilingual texts and using them for actual translations, that's also a skill a translator should have, to be able to crawl different sources, to evaluate actually the quality of data, and to transform this raw data into a format which can be used in his or her workflow. But I think the crucial part is the critical thinking again, because we just can't take everything what is on the internet for given. So.
It's also data that they produce, so basically feeding, for example, the machine translation. If you use Google Translate, I guess that whatever you translate through Google Translate, then it remains there. So, and coming back again to accountability, if I produce a correct text, then it remains there and it can help somebody else. If I write something wrong, then it tends to repeat itself, so something along those lines.
Something else I would like to add is, when we generally think about data, I guess we think about big data as in huge translation memories and huge glossaries and so on. But something that we in Leeds try and work with our students on is also for them to start tracking the time it takes them to do certain tasks. So we have a number of team projects throughout the year, and we give them certain tasks. So how long does it take you to do the communication with the client, the troubleshooting, I don't know, customizing a certain engine or working with something else. So I think we need this data and we don't have enough of it, and this is why I was saying in the beginning that we don't really understand how the whole process of translation really works. We have ideas and hypotheses, brilliant, but nothing, few things, we need more. So this is one aspect, and we need empirical data. Each individual translator needs empirical data, which is their own, on what makes them productive. Because from the clients and the industry as a whole, in any industry, we always hear faster, better, cheaper. And it's normal. So, we can have philosophical discussions about why that shouldn't be so, but it's not productive. So, but what can be done is for the individual linguist to find, rather than just follow whatever is the latest trend, find the conditions, the domains, the tools that makes them the most productive and the better and the faster translator. And for that, they need data, and I think people need to start tracking themselves without fear of Big Brother. You can be your own Big Brother, but you'll be better for it in the end, I think.
Okay, then last point in this discussion, technology in translation affecting quality positively or negatively?
as far as technical translation is concerned, then possibly, definitely yes, because you have consistency in terminology, among other many things that are better when you use tools, because it's your working memory actually, and you don't have that huge working memory at your disposal without these tools. And also, they provide you also with what other translators did actually, and if it was done correctly, then you should pay them some royalties. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I would say it depends. At the moment, the technology is just a tool in the hands of humans. And also, I would like to go back to my shoemaking analogy. When the mass production of footwear came, it allowed to produce greater volumes and faster, but not necessarily in higher quality, attention to detail and craftsmanship. So this is, I think, also the case with translation, because you are pushed to produce the translation faster, because everyone knows you have the tools and you should be able. But the end product may not be as good, actually.
I would say that when taken into consideration suitable text, so I would maybe exclude stylistically demanding text. Translation technology, I believe, is definitely helping the quality. If I may take the comparison of back maybe some 20 years when the Aki community was translated into Slovak, and there was one of the conditions was to turn in a translation memory. I remember that most of the translators didn't have a translation, or didn't have a CAT tool, and the TM was done as a part of the post-production. So the translation was done, and then they aligned the text and submitted it. And looking at it today, and at least from this perspective of what CAT tools, simple CAT tools can do in terms of quality assurance, I believe that you just can't compare it what was maybe 10 years ago and what is now. So I think the quality control is much higher, although there's a risk of the human to let it go and just maybe ignore some warnings and rely too much on technology and maybe on bad data in TM, etc. So it's there's a little bit of a risk, but I believe that in general it's an improvement.
Okay, I would say yes. Our scope in the university area is to show that there's another way, the new way, the modern way, how to work on text, on translation. I think that's our aim.
Daniel mentioned in the previous panel the expert systems a few decades back when talking about artificial intelligence. I think we should all remember that these tools that we all use are actually only doing what we tell them to do. There is no particular creativity or intelligence, at least not at the moment. But there is a danger with neural machine translation in that the fluency, consistently the fluency scores are higher, whereas the accuracy ones are not always there, which means that we have to be extra careful. So the job has just become, if it wasn't already, more cognitively demanding. But at the same time, the technology is advancing. We can help shape it, and in universities, in collaboration with companies as well, we can conduct studies and we can see exactly what these technologies, how they impact the profession as well.
there is one thing I also wanted to say, that actually we have to acknowledge one thing, one point, that a new interdisciplinary approach has to be adopted in translation studies. So, thank you.
Thank you all. We have still some time for questions or comments from the audience. Yeah, Mr. Gensler.
Thank you. I ran a translation company for some 25 years, and we did quite a bit of translation work. But the United States is not Europe, and it strikes me as if things are very, very different. At the risk of sounding too philosophical, I want to get into, or ask the panel a little bit about power dynamics and the relationship of the Slovak language or Slovakian to some of those larger languages that are stronger and older in the EU. And yes, maybe identity politics. For example, in the United States, we did a lot of work in immigrant languages, Haitian Creole, Bosnian, Vietnamese, and we created fairly large databases, Chinese as well, about what immigrant Chinese would look like, and should it be Beijing Chinese or Shanghai Chinese? Should it be Shanghai is much more open to international terminology, whereas Beijing has the better universities and is older, more traditional Chinese. Same thing in Vietnamese. The larger universities are in the north, and there's less language interference from French and English, whereas Saigon would be where a lot of the immigrant population in the United States. So the databases that we created at my university became sort of standard Vietnamese in the state of Massachusetts, or became the standard Chinese in the state for immigrant Chinese. Even Spanish, we chose a kind of generic Latin American Spanish, Colombian Spanish, as opposed to Puerto Rican Spanish, which is the dominant Spanish spoken in Massachusetts, but it's also very heavily influenced and infiltrated by English terminologies. So when you get into, say, the computer industry and US terms or French terms, or you're really, it strikes me as if you and the variety of industries that you represent are very much involved in writing Slovakian today, and what's going to be in those databases, what's the language is going to look like for the next generation.
Yes, actually, at DGT, for example, we are not only, setting the right wording for technical terms, but for the whole legislation,
Politics, exactly.
And it's translators who are doing this. Translators. We have to understand British law, American law, part of international law, then Slovak law, and that's it. So that cannot be replaced by any machine. It's impossible. And that's the principle of the multilingualism in Europe.
It's exciting.
So that every citizen has a right to understand what the law is about in his own language, native language.
I'm afraid I don't know anything about Slovak. I'm Romanian. But I wanted to mention a study that was done by, or a report that was released by the Common Sense Advisory a while back, and it was called "Can't Read, Won't Buy." And it seems that as soon as there is a potential financial gain for companies, they are more than willing to go into to develop localization strategies and employ in-country experts, as opposed to just do a rough translation, literal will do, or even leave the original untouched. In the games localization industry, there are varieties between the level of acceptance of English, and that's why you will have different levels of localization, from full localization with the packaging, the user-generated content as well being localized, the support for the voiceovers, the storyline, everything, to subtitles and perhaps a help file. But that will depend on how engaged the community is, what the potential for growth is at the moment. And interestingly enough, at least in my limited experience, these metrics are still being developed, and they have tied very closely to the more general marketing metrics, where you would go and ask someone, does it make sense to go into this company, into this locale or this country? And they might have a very quick Google Analytics report and tell you about some visitors from the country, but not very insightful comments. So there is clearly a power dynamic, there's also a financial dynamic there, and some countries have their own academies of languages, and they protecting the heritage and the language, and they further it. Others are quite away from there. There are organizations in the world like Translators Without Borders who are fighting against this imperialism from one language or another. So there is a lot of good separate work going on, and these people should be acknowledged and recognized, but for sure your point is one of the biggest problems perhaps we're facing.
I would maybe add that if you were talking about Slovak or asking about Slovak, as we are a fairly small country of 5 million inhabitants, it's also a very small market, and it can be really seen that if you buy a battery charger for your car, you would get a not very good translation for that, as we heard the example in the beginning.
If I can just interrupt you a little bit on that matter. I don't know if all of you understood what can happen if you use a car battery charger inside the building. So look it up on the internet.
So if you have a very minor or very unimportant cheap product, and the translations would be not really good because the budget to actually to convey the message in the local language is not there, or it's very limited. On the contrary, you have big companies like Microsoft, Google or Apple who are really investing into localization, and then they when they choose the right partners, we use really local experts to put the language, basically sometimes create the new terminology in our language. Then you can see that in these cases there's new terminology coming. There's I would say that they are many times used as a some kind of like pivot for additional translations. For example, the Microsoft glossary, etc. So this I think is positive, but there's a lot of influence mostly from English. I would say that we have a lot of English words in Slovak that you would use on a daily basis, talking to friends, family, etc.
I'm afraid we have to finish here because our time is up. I would like to thank all the panelists for their valuable input. Now there will be a 5-minute break, and then there are 3 parallel workshops where actually what we discussed will be followed up. So thank you very much.